the Baraga County Chamber of Commerce for supporting this video. All right. After years of expenses, labor, and even death, it was time for the first train to ride the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad. The train wouldn't travel far. It was just doing a test run down part of the track, and it would only carry a watchman and an engineer. But this trip would pave the way for something wonderful, a new railroad that traveled from a Michigan iron mine to an ore dock on Lake Superior. It was a project that would help get precious metals to countless people, and it would supply jobs for an economy that was very dependent on mining. So, all in all, it was a big day. So as the story goes, at least according to a local newspaper, the engine was started and the train got moving. It was the beginning of it. What? Once the train was underway, the newspaper reported that the ground under the tracks supposedly collapsed and the train went into a ditch. And that was the last train to ride the railroad. This is the story of the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad. It starts with a brilliant idea, and the equivalent of about $65 million later, it ends with a train supposedly in a ditch, a valley blasted through some of the oldest rock on Earth, an outbreak of typhoid, and also a project manager who might have fled the country. Buckle up. The story begins in the late 1880s in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. At this time, most towns were dependent on logging or mining, including a small town called Champion. But thankfully, things were going well there. Workers at the iron mines were pulling metal out of the ground, money was flowing, and business was good. So at some point, somebody had a brilliant idea. Let's build a railroad. As for who that somebody was, I've seen conflicting accounts. One historian said it isn't clear who came up with this idea, while another said it was a group of Champion mine owners and investors. Regardless, the end result would be a new railroad that would ultimately support the mine. That way, the mine could stop paying another railroad to ship their ore, and could create a new track that would be cheaper, would create jobs, would put more money in the business, and might even open up the local Huron Mountains for more industry. The trains would pick up iron-bearing rock from Champion, chug along the Peshekee River for a bit, then follow the Slate River to an ore dock at the Huron Bay that was already being built for a slate quarry. The project would come to be known as the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad, and it was gonna be great. The contractor on the project, Wallace Dingman, even assured the team that the whole thing would be done in a little over a year. But then again, anything sounds possible at the beginning of a project. Now, whenever I'm learning about a story like this, I always try to see if there's a place I can visit. Because putting all of the facts and narratives together like this is great. But I also love putting myself in the room where it happened, if you will. Which is how I ended up in what I will affectionately call the middle of nowhere. On a sunny afternoon, my husband and I set out for the Huron Mountains. Our goal was to make it to a really cool, significant site that's part of this story. And things were going well for a while. This part of Baraga County is gorgeous, and the roads were shockingly okay. But then our path turned into, well, this. And considering we were on our own, we decided, hey, maybe off-roading wasn't the best idea. So the Huron Mountains had defeated us. But then the Baraga County Chamber of Commerce connected me with Bert, who owns a 4-seat ATV and was generous enough to give us a lift deeper into the mountains on another day. Not gonna lie, I'd never been on an ATV before, and my goodness, this is the way to travel. Our day turned into a full-on adventure in the Huron Mountains, featuring the tallest spot in Michigan and a couple of bonus waterfalls. And in the end, we did make it to our destination, complete with finding some of the old railroad track. So I'll pick up the story of Wallace Dingman and the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad from here. So the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad began construction in 1890, and almost immediately, Wallace Dingman ran out of money. Turns out his bid for the contract was way too low. Maybe he just got ambitious in an attempt to be competitive, or maybe he seriously underestimated the Huron Mountains. Today, the Huron Mountains don't look like much compared to other mountain ranges, but that's because they're about 1 billion years old. They've had a lot of time to wear down. But this area definitely isn't smooth. It's surprisingly rugged out here. So workers on the railroad had to seriously level the ground and reinforce it with things like rock and tree trunks. And then there were the outcroppings. See, the Huron Mountains sit on part of the Canadian Shield, which is like the heart of North America. It's like the nucleus or the foundation for the continent. It's also extremely tough rock. It's a kind of granite and is made of pieces of minerals like quartz and feldspar that are harder than steel. And all throughout these mountains, those pieces of granite stick out, sometimes in huge outcroppings. The trouble was, if the railroad wanted to stick to their plan of following the Slate River, they're gonna have to do something about one of those outcroppings. This one in particular. Instead of just tunneling through the rock, they decided to blast it out into a ditch. And today it's called the Summit Rock Cut. But blasting through some of the oldest, hardest rock on the planet was maybe more than Wallace Dingman planned on. Even with multiple tons of explosive powder, steam drills, and about 1,000 men, it still took workers nearly a year to make this rock cut. It also cost about $500,000, or the equivalent of about $16 million once you adjust for inflation. All to make a ditch I can walk in this many seconds. Imagine spending a year to build something that you can walk in like 70 to 90 seconds. And that wasn't even the end of this. While workers were building this rock cut, they were also living in this area in a collection of log buildings and partially underground structures, and often without sufficient resources. And you know what happens when you put a bunch of people in close quarters without sufficient supplies or hygiene? Typhoid. Typhoid fever is caused by a type of bacterium, and it spreads through contaminated food, water, or close contact with people who are sick. And the symptoms are similar to like a really bad stomach flu. If someone has access to antibiotics, it usually clears up in a few days. But in the early 1890s, antibiotics had not been formally discovered yet. So here, things got bad fast. Like one doctor remarked, the Champion Hospital was filled as well as the house next door. The death wagon used to come up at night and haul away the dead at night. The exact records of how many died seem to have been lost, but either way, it does not seem like it was just a few people. Also, to make matters even worse somehow, since Dingman had so significantly underestimated the cost of this project, people weren't getting paid. One person on the project named Milo Davis, who might have been a supervisor or maybe just acted as a PR guy, accounts vary, Davis was even dragged through the mud in court because there weren't adequate supplies for the workers. Still though, the project didn't stop. Dingman was eventually kicked out. The company found some loans to generally pay its team, and against all of the odds, the project was finally completed in November 1892. That month, the final rail was put down and the ore dock at Huron Bay was completed. Except hold the confetti cannons, because investors were still really nervous about this. Because sure, the tracks were done, but they could also get up to about 4 times steeper than what was typical. And when you consider that these trains were supposed to be barreling downhill full of heavy iron ore, well, it starts to get dangerous. In fact, the editor at a local newspaper noted that hauling ore would be, quote, practically impossible at those angles. And then of course there's that story from the intro where a train tried to ride up the tracks and supposedly promptly fell over. So the completed railroad seems to have just sat there for almost 10 years. Maybe it was because of safety concerns or the falling price of iron ore, or because a competing railroad company lowered their prices so much that the Iron Range and Huron Bay Company wouldn't be able to compete. Or maybe it was all of those things. But one way or another, 1900 rolled in, and not a single train had made a real trip on the tracks. So that year, a team from Detroit headed north to disassemble the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad. In the end, the $65 million project, once you adjust for inflation, had been sold to men in the city for the equivalent of under $4 million. And as for Milo Davis, that maybe supervisor or maybe PR guy, well, depending on who you ask, he either moved or fled to Mexico, possibly to avoid becoming the company's scapegoat in any ensuing legal battles. So when that watchman and engineer supposedly took their trip on the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad, they became the only 2 passengers that line ever carried. So in a way, this company paid the equivalent of about $65 million for 2 dudes to take a dramatic joyride in the mountains. What stuck with me about this story, though, isn't just that funny anecdote. It's how much work and hardship went into this project for seemingly nothing. The Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad had an enormous opportunity to build a successful business and support their community, and because of what I interpret as some poor planning, they let that opportunity slip away. Still, it did make me smile to learn that the railroad was not completely useless. Today, the railroad forms the foundation for County Road 607 in Baraga and Marquette counties, and at least one family got to enjoy the tracks. A girl named Jessie Abbott spent her summers with Mr. Beck, the railroad watchman, and his wife, and she and her family spent countless hours exploring the tracks, using a handcar or a flat car to ride along them, and even snowshoeing the tracks in the winter. So as we wrap up, I'll leave you with one quote that stayed with me recently, a moment of solace in a wild, bumpy, occasionally tragic bit of history. The failure of the Iron Range and Huron Bay Railroad was a great disappointment and financial loss to many, Jessie later wrote, but its idle existence for years in what is even yet a wilderness provided one family with unusual experiences and happy memories. This is a handyman's encyclopedia, by the way. Although the IR&HB Railroad very much missed their chance at success, it's been cool for me to learn while working on this project that Baraga County is still a place of opportunity, and that hasn't changed. People of all ages are discovering this area as a great place to establish roots, raise a family, start a business, work remotely, and enjoy a life surrounded by beautiful spaces and outdoor activities. If you'd like to learn more about this place, you can visit huonbay.org or click the link in the description. I have genuinely enjoyed all of the time I've ever spent in Baraga County, so highly recommend checking it out. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you soon.